And he maintains the 2-point lead, Robert.
Yeah, he did exactly as you foretold. He decided to use some of the match clock, get closer and closer to the shorter time controls. And are we getting this double fianchetto again? The answer clearly is yes.
And once again, Hans has responded in the same way every time with a single fianchetto. We, again, might get some knight h4 action. They are repeating move for move, I think, what we just saw in Hikaru's last white game.
So I don't know what more to say about this. In the previous game, the knight went to h4. It was awkward, but it was very strong because it eventually was able to land, or try to land on the f5 square, I should say. So in this one, d3, a calm setup, nothing traded just yet, 10 moves into the game, and Hans is going in for a think. So he's just trying to change his strategy, but this should play to Hikaru's benefit because he is choosing this for a reason. He feels comfortable in the style of position that we have. So Danya, where is the changeup going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Hans should try a different opening setup because it does seem like Hikaru is so experienced in these types of positions. He knows where the pieces belong, when to make the knight jump, when to take the pawn on d5. It's something that you develop not by reading a book, not by learning a course, but just by playing hundreds, maybe thousands, or in Hikaru's case, probably tens of thousands of games in the same structure. We see Hans kind of making these non-committal moves, now going for a concrete decision. Bishop to a3. Oftentimes, white tries not to allow this because of how good the dark-squared bishop is. In this case, though, we might see Hikaru trading on a3, deflecting black's queen to an awkward square, and then opening up the center. But Hikaru starts with c takes d5, and maybe that gives Hans a chance to take on b2. No, Hans simply recaptures on d5. We might get that trade on a3. Maybe white's bishop is going to shift out to h3, pinning the knight on d7. We saw Hikaru do this in the previous white game. He's doing it again. Bishop h3. Now he's inviting Hans's rook to move away from c8, but that's going to expose the c7 pawn. So you can see just despite the unimposing facade of white's position, despite the fact that black has better center control, black has a lot of squares that he needs to babysit. And again, Hikaru pushes the pawn up to d4. Now we got more of a traditional Carlsbad structure, Robert. And once again, I'm just liking white's position a little bit more here.
The nuances, right? The bishop on h3 is better than the bishop on b7. The knight on d7, it's stuck because that pawn on d4 outclasses it. A pawn 3 squares away for a knight often dominates it, and here that's very much the case. And there's the superfluous knights, as the late, great Jeremy Silman would talk about. The knight on d7, knight on f6. They're kind of fighting for the same square, and as you're pointing out, the white knight can reroute itself into the action.
The white's knights are maneuvering beautifully, and they never seem to get in each other's way. Knight e2 would be the tempting move for me. Obviously, black is likely to respond with c7, c5, creating some central tension. Anything else catching your eye, Robert? Knight h4 is likely going to be met with g6. We sometimes see knight h4 and then the knight coming back to f3 if you think g6 is a serious weakness. But I don't think it's worth spending a tempo on that. Hans, he doesn't play c5. He tries to stay solid with c6, but he's cramped and his position is just uncomfortable. And there's no clear plan here for black.
More fun to play Hikaru's position, that's for sure. The knight f4 can drop back to d3 and maybe up to e5 at some point. Also, white can expand on the queen side. a4 is an idea in some positions. Try to go a5, a4, b4 play with a pawn minority attack. We see this in Carlsbad structures, which isn't quite this, but it resembles it. And Hikaru's playing very quickly, Danya. It seems like he feels at home in this position.
Yeah, it's a Carlsbad structure for white. It's more like Carl's good structure for white. And that knight on e5, that's definitely going to be pretty Carl's good. Pawn on c6 is going to be under fire, but now we get a version of a question nobody likes to ask themselves. Which rook do I put on d1? Well, similar to that, which knight do you put on e5? Hikaru says, I'm kicking the can down the road. b4, fixing the pawn on c6 and preventing c5.
And a4, a5 becomes a more legitimate idea. That pawn on b6 is what's preventing the white knight on d3 from entering the black position. And that bishop on b7, it's really a pawn at the moment. It has to go back to c8 at some turn, but it's not easy to do with the c6 pawn being so loose.
Well, I think you wish it were a pawn. If you could play b6 to b7, that might even be worth sacrificing the bishop. I'm just kidding. Of course, good call, Robert. a4. Just notice the way Hikaru is using every inch of the board. He put the bishop on h3. Now he makes a move on the opposite side of the board. He wants to go a5, as you said, weakening the c5 square. And it's the collection of small victories for white. That's how you win a game positionally. Nothing big, nothing cataclysmic has happened. Black has just lost a lot of these small battles. When you lose too many of them, you end up losing the war. And right now, he is losing this game because knight comes to e5. The other knight has a beautiful spot on c5. Ugh.
Yeah, the c6 pawn is tender. If you could pick up a black knight and put it on c4, we'd be talking about a very different type of game. And that's because black has an outpost there, but a knight can't reach there very easily. And what do you
start saying, like, I really want to make this illegal move, and then I really want to make this other illegal move, that's a pretty bad sign for your position.
Yeah, it is, but that's what black's position looks like to me. And I often say the side that controls the pawn breaks is the side with the advantage. And look at pawn breaks on the king side now. You can play h4, you can play f4, you can play g4. You can just throw all your pawns up the board because black's pieces are stuck on the queen side. They're passive. There are pawns in front of them. And if we talk about open lines, the c file is semi-open. White has an open line all the way up to c6. And look at black's rook on c7. It's just passively defending that pawn. And look at Hikaru go. He said, the end game will still be much better for me. I think Hans did the right thing. He wants a knight on d6 up to c4, but it's clear, Danya, white is the side for choice.
Yeah, and semi-open files, it's like getting a cookie when your sibling doesn't get one. They taste a lot better than when your opponent can partake. And now the decision for Hikaru, do you trade queens? This is often the hardest part of the conversion process. You've done everything right. You've gotten all the squares, but you need to make that final push. You need to convert your advantage into something tangible, either an attack. In this case, probably material advantage, because Hans is very likely to start dropping some pawns pretty soon. Don't do this at home. Don't do this unless you're a professional. Hikaru sliding his queen into b6. Black would love bishop b7, a7, just to add to our theme here. But I am getting more and more concerned here as the knight's dropping into c5. In black's position, you can just feel it creaking and crumbling.
Rook c2, rook c1, some very natural moves for white, just to pile up maximum pressure on that black c6 pawn. And I've learned something new about you, Donna. You're a mean brother. I always liked it when my siblings also got to eat the sweets. So
I think my brother's watching this broadcast right now, so, man, you're sabotaging me here.
You sabotaged yourself, buddy.
I agree.
Well, that queen on b6, it's not sabotaging white's position. It's safe there, right? It's very difficult to move that bishop from b7. If you move to a8, you drop a6. If you move to c8, you drop c6. So it doesn't actually seem like black has any easy moves right now. What would you do here? Would you play knight d7, trying to trade off at least that pesky knight on e5?
I'm at a loss, and I think Hans is as well. I mean, if you could go knight e8 and f6 maybe to push this knight off of e5, I think that's one move too many, because knight e8, it can run into bishop takes e4. And by the way, Hikaru also could play f3 and just kick this knight off of e4. He doesn't even have to trade it. And Hans, you could just see him piling all the defensive firepower he has to make sure that a6 and c6 are protected. Because if either of those pawns fall, he's just screwed immediately.
It's one of these positions where a student gets it and like white must be winning and tries to sacrifice something or end the game on the spot. But there is no knockout. F3 kicks the knight to g5, knight goes to f4, and you see that it's still in favor of white. So I'm ignoring that question mark. I feel like it's harsh. White's position is still clearly good. And practically speaking, Danya, up a minute plus on the clock with control of every vital square, you have to like white's position. And okay, now there's some knight takes d7, queen takes, there's knight takes d5 in that position. The rook on c7 was loose.
Ooh, some tactics action possible there. Hikaru has also maintained a 1 minute time advantage this entire time, which is really impressive because converting is a time-consuming process. But the queen drops back to c5. Hans has sort of beaten back the first wave of attack, but Hikaru has kept all of the fundamental positional advantages here. Knight to e6, very tempting, but maybe that single bishop endgame not to his liking. f5. Desperate situations call for desperate measures, but knight g5 to c4 might become a legal move pretty soon.
At last. If that knight can get to c4, black suddenly breathes a slight sigh of relief, but the side that controls the pawn breaks is the side we tend to prefer. h4 followed by e4 will be available, and that way you're just trying to chisel and open up more lines for the white pieces. But rook c1 takes c6, like sacrificing the exchange, is also something we should consider.
That's one of the hardest parts of converting an advantage. It's transforming it. It's being comfortable with essentially saying, yeah, I love my position, I like everything about it, but I'm going to try to take this advantage and convert it into something else. He starts with e4, Robert. You did a bit of a double take. What's Hikaru seeing here? Is he going to sack a pawn to get rid of black's knight? That does not seem too convincing, because that bishop on b7, I mean, it's solid as a rock. It can eventually get involved through c8. Maybe he's playing for Hans's clock again as he gets down under 30 seconds.
Black has 3 pieces staring at the square. White only has 2, but it forces black to take with a knight on e4. So it'll be great knight for white against very poor bishop for black. So he's saying it's worth a pawn. And Hans, he's using all of his remaining time. He takes on e4. This position we could have predicted 20 seconds ago. And as you're highlighting there, 96 to c5. And if king g8 is your only move, Yikes.
Well, he found it. And he found king h8 against Magnus yesterday. He lost that game in the end due to Magnus's wizardry, but what a cold-blooded response, making sure that 96 doesn't come with check. That gives him a tempo to do what, Robert, if 96 happens?
There's some rook e8 ideas, and the knight gets pinned because there's pins on the d file. And
Speaking of knights getting pinned.
there it is. But what if the white king goes up to e3? I feel like white controls every square in this position.
And 96, Hikaru finding the right time to do it. Not yet, because that rook from f8 could have gotten involved. Han's still keeping everything under control, other than his clock. He's down to 6 seconds. He's up a pawn. Will we see Hikaru take it, or will he use this as an umbrella to basically keep his king away from any possible checks?
There's no rush to take it. I guess black could play bishop f5 at some point to protect it, but the bishop
stopped raining five hours ago. No umbrella necessary.
Gosh. Oh, but look at this. It's another umbrella. That king is safe on d4, and even though black is up a pawn, black is losing because white is far more active.
And finally, Hikaru finds a way to break through. The a6 pawn might be the deciding factor here after all. The c6 pawn is long gone. Finally, you can gang up on that pawn. You can take it right now. You could bring the other rook to the 6th rank. The patience has been really impressive here, but one last bit of accuracy required. Han's desperately trying to get active.
Well, rook f6 check forces the king to g file. King e7 gets mated.
Oh.
Rook c to e6. That would be a pretty nasty checkmate to see on the board. And otherwise, I feel like Hikaru has a choice. Does he move the rook first? Does he move his knight? He goes back to h3. There's no h6, so g5 is dropping.
That knight it needs to be paid overtime. It could have gone back to f2 if necessary. Now you can go up to g5, back to f4. Now it's a perfect outpost. Take that pawn already, Hikaru.
He could take it and then go back to the c file. It's why he didn't take it earlier.
Rook e4 wins.
Knight e6 is the threat.
And if rook c4, king takes d5.
You've been doing your puzzle rush. I saw you doing that before the show.